Good afternoon, folks, and thanks, Matt. For those who don't know me, I'm Tim Baird. I'm the transportation planner in Fehr Peers Salt Lake City office, and I'm also our office's big data lead. So I'm very excited to share a little bit of the work that we've been doing over the past year with the National Park Service to help them understand big data resources and evaluate how big data providers like Streetlight can be useful in their planning, specifically in the case of Colorado. That being said, we've used Streetlight a lot in Utah as well, but this is sort of the geographic area that we're using as a test bed for evaluating this for the NPS. So in terms of project goals, this is really a unique study. Sorry, next slide, please. It's a unique study in terms of being an opportunity to explore the potential of big data and understand some of the trade-offs, better use cases, less appropriate use cases, without being tied down to a specific project timeline or a set of outcomes. Instead, the goals really were oriented around helping NPS staff better understand what role big data can play in their transportation planning efforts, in their visitor use management strategies, through a better understanding of mobile device data. So they were interested in specifically drilling down into, okay, how do data sources like Streetlight fit into understanding travel at a regional scale across the whole state, at a individual park unit scale, at the individual attraction or corridor scale within a park, as well as understanding some of the variations across time, seasons, times of day, days of the week, and so forth, and user groups. So next slide, please. When we went into this project, we came in really as a data agnostic consultant. We were not tied in with Streetlight or any other provider as a committed partner. Rather, our approach was to say, hey, we're going to work with you to understand what your needs are in terms of what you want this data to do and what the context is. We're going to talk to different providers, understand what do your sample sizes look like, what are the pros and cons of your product. And ultimately, we determined after exploring offerings from several providers that Streetlight really fit the needs well of several of the key study questions that we wanted to ask here, specifically around park level and regional origin destination data, understanding trip sequences, understanding dwell time, amount of time people are spending at different locations in the course of their journeys, as well as being able to weigh in on speed and travel time. So ultimately, we ended up purchasing 2 years of trip data across Colorado, with key inclusion criteria just being that people made at least one stop at a national park or some other NPS site. So this added up to over 6 million data points that were usable across these 4 data sets. Some of those are overlap in terms of the same people making trips, and we're seeing different aspects and elements of their trips, but it's really a very rich data set that's provided with a lot of insights into both regional and park level travel behavior. So I'm just going to walk through today a handful of the highlights from this data, a few of the insights that we've drawn through it, and a few thoughts on potential applications, not just for Colorado and the National Park Service, but also for different entities in Utah. So the project extent covered 13 national parks, monuments, recreation areas, historic sites, and national preserves, as well as over 30 gateway communities and welcome centers, where we wanted to understand what the interactions were of people traveling to the parks from these locations, and then over 100 combined internal points of interest and corridors within or providing access to these parks. That said, for the purposes of this presentation, and for a lot of in the full project deep dives that we conducted, we focused in a lot on Rocky Mountain National Park. This is kind of our main focus area for many of the detailed analyses and case studies, and just sort of being a proof of concept. And there are a couple of reasons for that, which we get into a little on the next slide. The biggest one is just that it had the largest sample of data. We saw about 200,000 total trips in our sample from these 2 years. And so this really adds up to kind of a critical mass of being able to slice and dice this data in a lot of different ways across time, across user groups, and so forth. It also was one of the parks that saw the highest percentage of non-resident visitation. So we were able to disaggregate the data by whether travelers had a home location in Colorado or somewhere outside of the state. And this helps us to sort of understand, okay, are there differences in how more local people are using these recreational assets versus out-of-state travelers? And here we saw a good split there of about 40-60 for out-of-state versus Colorado residents. Next slide, please. So one of the big challenges in using conventional big data products to understand long-distance trip behavior is just that people are often making multi-stage trips. So if I'm traveling, say, from Denver to Colorado National Monument, going pretty much clear across the state, I'm probably going to make a few stops along the way, stop for gas, stop for lunch, use a rest stop, things like that, and that can interrupt the trip records. So we worked with Streetlight to develop kind of a custom adaptation of their default product here that strung together multiple trips that were going between our key study area geography. So this allowed us to sort of aggregate these multi-step records into a single record and a single trip that gives us good visibility of how people are making longer distance journeys. So for example, looking at how people are traveling to Rocky Mountain National Park, we saw that the majority of trips were coming from nearby gateway communities like Estes Park and Grand Lake, which are kind of on either side of Rocky Mountain National Park, but also saw a lot of trips coming from places like the Denver metro area or Colorado Springs, Fort Collins, et cetera, and sort of getting around that potential issue of those longer trips getting interrupted. We're also able to pull out from this data set a few insights on sort of the seasonality of trips, and saw that we have higher shares of visitation during the winter months than in this data sample than park counts collected by NPS would actually tell us. Now, we're not certain of why that is, but our inference here is that there may in fact be some undercounting of off-peak visitation during times when you don't have as many park personnel on the ground, and maybe some of the data gathering through conventional means are missing some of the travel to those areas. Going from the regional scale of trips across the state down to trips within an individual park, we found that this was just an extremely rich data set that we were able to get here. And the key thing that we adapted from Streetlight's default offering was chaining together trips. So we could understand not just where are people going to and from between, say, a gateway, visitor center, trailheads, campgrounds, things like that within a park, but what's the sequence in which they're visiting each of those attractions. So this chart, obviously it's not too legible at this scale, but it shows the first 7 steps of approximately 100,000 recorded internal trip sequences. So this is about 99% of the observed stops that we had within the park in our data sample. And you can see just sort of the richness of, people are going from one location to another, and then we can see, okay, from everybody who's gone to some intermediate destination, where are they going from there? We had to do some distillation to get this into a more human readable kind of format. So on the next slide, for example, you'll see how people entering the park on the western side at the Beaver Meadows entrance, which is kind of the main entrance to the park from Estes Park, are moving through to different internal destinations, and how that, our inference of how that gets distributed across the road network within the park. The trip sequence format also allows us to really dig into detailed questions about internal destinations. So for example, we looked at every one of the internal destinations within Rocky Mountain National Park and asked, okay, are people typically visiting that as the first or maybe second stop in their trip through the park, or are they visiting it as a later, third, fourth, nth stop along the way after having visited a couple of other locations? So this was able to inform us, for example, that some of the more remote trailheads, people were more likely to be making a dedicated trip just to that location. Whereas some of the areas in the Bear Lake Corridor, if you happen to know Rocky Mountain, were often ones where people were making multiple stops before going to those trailheads or scenic overlooks and areas along that area. So it helps to understand how people are sequencing out visits to different parts of the park. It also provides us on the next slide with some information about which areas within the park are more popular with in-state versus out-of-state visitors. So we're starting to get into kind of the demographics of different user groups and what parts of these recreational assets they're valuing and using more. So for example, we saw Colorado residents overrepresented in users of campgrounds and more remote trailheads, whereas non-residents were more likely to be, sort of disproportionately represented at places like scenic overlooks. One of the other pieces that was a big value add, I think, for our clients here was getting at dwell time. So not just how are people moving through the park, what's the travel element of their journey, but also once they've stopped somewhere and ended their vehicular trip, how much time are they spending at a place? So this can weigh in on parking needs and management, understanding parking turnover, feasibility of transit services, and a whole host of other kind of visitor use management pieces. And so we were able to see through the streetlight sample the amount of time spent by visitors at different locations dimmed from minutes to, through all day or overnight stays. So on the next slide, you'll see a breakdown where the green and yellow represent shorter stops at locations across these parks, whereas the orange and red represent, steps of multiple hours or all day. So we saw some interesting findings out of this that, for example, at some of the most popular scenic overlooks, 60% of your visitors, a very solid majority, are spending less than 15 minutes at those locations. On the other hand, we were able to identify places where a solid majority of visitors were spending, multiple hours or overnight stays in different areas. So it helps to understand kind of the demand profile of travel there and then use and parking in those locations. We were also able to extend this kind of dwell time analysis to a different context of gateway communities. And there the questions are a little bit different. We're able to ask, are people stopping for just a few minutes and maybe using a restroom, stopping for gas? Are they stopping for a couple hours, maybe getting a meal and doing some shopping? Are they staying overnight and then patronizing a hotel? So this starts to get at what's the relationship of visitors to parks and their local communities that are nearby and supporting those areas. And it can be helpful for the community relationship building side of things and understanding economic development opportunities. So here, for example, we drilled down a little bit into overnight stays at Estes Park. And we were able to drill down as well onto how the proportion of overnight stays varied across seasons and weekday versus weekend. So for example, here we saw a higher share of all day and overnight stays during the peak season and on weekdays, maybe when people are making longer trips and spending more time around the park. One of the last pieces that we pulled in this analysis as well was some corridor level data on speed and travel time metrics. So you can see we got both free flow speeds and congested speeds during our peak season, during peak hours. So while this isn't necessarily a substitute for detailed travel data gathering at a corridor level, it's very useful for sort of providing another set of data points against which to compare user or staff perceptions and say, okay, from a data-oriented perspective, where do we have the biggest congestion problems? So for example, here we saw on US 36, one of the main access roads through Estes Park, we saw up to 50% reductions in congested speeds versus free flow during our peak times. Now, we were fortunate enough to be able to share these results with a group of NPS stakeholders, as well as a few folks from Colorado Department of Transportation and other agencies. The response was really positive. Direct quote, "I can use the crap out of this," said one planner. So there was a lot of positive reception of the value of this data package for uses like visitor use management and understanding parking needs with that dwell time data, being able to just better define and pinpoint potential problems, as well as identifying underutilized resources that in crowded conditions, people might be able to be channeled towards more with marketing or visitor information services. They were very interested as well, although this data sample didn't directly touch on it, in the potential of Streetlight or other data providers that are collecting data on a live and ongoing basis and are able to provide both backwards-looking data and very up-to-date data in understanding how travel patterns are changing with COVID situation or other big factors, whether that's around the economy, around weather, or what have you. And also to just provide a better grounding for interagency coordination, sort of a common base of data when NPS is trying to coordinate with state DOTs, tourism offices, and so forth. And of course, this isn't something that's just applicable to Colorado. There's a lot of applications for Utah as well in this data to support efforts like traffic analysis and corridor plans, parking management, regional transportation plans, whether they're focused on recreation or not, supporting travel demand modeling efforts, and understanding feasibility of transit in sort of resort and recreational contexts. So that's what I have to share with you folks today. Thanks so much for joining. Got my contact and Erica's, who's the NPS lead on this project. So feel free to contact us with any questions or throw questions in the chat. With that, I'll pass it off to Chris. Thanks, folks.